internet to an introduction to William Ronald Fairbairn's ideas and theories. So the reason why I wanted to talk about Fairbairn is that I find that he's a brilliant theoretician, and also that he doesn't quite get the recognition that he deserves. And what I mean by that is that he has kind of like flown under the radar, but his influence has nevertheless been very impactful in psychoanalysis. And I'm gonna try and, in this very abridged version of his theories, try to present the core of his theories, his ideas, and also who he was. So let's start with who was the man Fairbairn. So he was a Scottish psychiatrist, and he was also a minister. He started as a minister, and then he specialized in medicine and afterwards in psychoanalysis. So there you have it. There's his path as a person. However, what makes him interesting is that he wrote a collection of papers. So to my understanding, he never quite wrote a book. This is the collection of his papers, which are titled Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality, which I have reviewed on this channel, and it's a very good collection of papers, but the ideas behind them are even more interesting. So for Fairbairn, what you have to understand is that he takes Freudian metapsychology and changes it. And what makes it so interesting is that he's going to go for the premise that the libido is object-seeking. That's one of his core fundamental tenets in his metapsychology, meaning that the libido, contrary to Freud, where it's a drive that's there and the object is interchangeable, for Fairbairn that's not the case. The libido can only be activated or flourish through relationships, through human connection. In this sense, the libido is a flagpole for the object, meaning that basically both are intertwined. You can't separate them. There's not the libido on one side and the object on the other. They're connected in a very, very fundamental way. And all his metapsychology is built on that intrinsic connection between the both elements. So what makes it so important? Well, I feel that his theories kind of explain a lot of phenomena. For example, Spitz. If you don't know, Spitz is a psychiatrist that studied very, very young infants, and he discovered that some very young infants, if they were not loved and cared for, not fed right or changed, but if they really weren't loved, cared for, looked by the adult, those infants tended to die, to let themselves die. And I think that has remained a big mystery. But with Fairbairn's approach, it's kind of understandable. The child does not exist without the parent. And as such, if the parent is not there to trigger something of the drives within the child is going to perish because he's not part of the human community. He's not part of something bigger than himself. He has nothing to relate to put himself in, and someone that in reverse helps him identify, and so on and so forth. So I think with Fairbairn's approach, we can start to understand the mechanisms of this very fundamental phenomena that Spitz talked about. And from that idea comes a plethora of other ideas that are as important, if not more important. Because for Fairbairn, what's going to happen to the mind, for Freud, the mind is going to break off more or less. But for Fairbairn, that break-off is like fundamental. It's at the crux of everything. That break-off is due to frustration, anger, and feelings that the infant can't handle on their own, created by the outside environment. So for Fairbairn, it's what happens is that the infant lives in his inner world, and he corresponds with the outside world. And the outside world can only be, at some point, frustrating. There's no hope in the fact that frustration has to come through. Frustration is at the core of everything in Fairbairn's vision. And when that frustration comes, the infant is going to try and deal with it in a very particular way by splitting his ego, because that's another big point of Fairbairn. The ego is Freudian ego is broken up into many parts. So very simply, what you have to understand is that there are three types of egos for Fairbairn. There is the central ego, which is basically your Freudian ego. It's the basis of the identity, and the one that holds the most continuous form for the individual, meaning that the individual always identifies to the central ego. And when he's not overwhelmed by unconscious egos, or the sub-egos, as Fairbairn calls them, it's basically the more, how can I say, static ego. It's the one that has the more solidity and that can cope better with handling frustration. There is also two sub-egos. Those ones are unconscious in nature. Because for Fairbairn, there is no id. There is those sub-egos, and there are two of them. The libidinal ego and the antilibidinal ego. So the libidinal ego, very interestingly enough, for Fairbairn, is this idea of attachment, but it's also overvaluing attachment. It's sacrificing a part of oneself for the attachment. So it's very important to understand that it's a will to attach oneself, but also to sacrifice oneself at the same time. So they both come together, and it's something you can see clinically when people, for example, battered wives, go back to their husbands. It's Salani, a clinical psychologist, talks about it in this very interesting book. And he says that basically what brings them back is the hope that the relationship can be rekindled. And that relationship can be rekindled because the libidinal ego believes that the other one is what Fairbairn calls an exciting object. In an object that in the fantasy of the person could fulfill every need, cut off every frustration, anything that has ever gone wrong could be rectified. And that fantasy is incredibly powerful because it has such a sway on the mind that the libidinal ego is going to overpower the central ego, meaning the consciousness of the individual, and create an unconscious pattern where the person is going to try and grab that relationship and try and protect it at any cost, or regain it at any cost. And when I mean any cost, it can go very far. As Fairbairn said, the libidinal ego is the number one reason of therapeutic failure, because the individual is so attached to that object, to the other person, to the relationship, that they will sacrifice even everything that they have to regain the relationship. Meaning that everything that the central ego stands for is going to be ditched for the libidinal ego. That's the true danger of the libidinal ego pushed to the extreme. Of course, there's a normal-ish version of it when we're afraid of losing a relationship. It's not necessarily the full-blown libidinal ego, but in its full-blownness, it has the devastating effects on the individual and the relationship. And what you have to understand is that for Fairbairn, this is the big problem, because as we're going to see, the other ego is troublesome, but not as troublesome, very interestingly enough. So it's love, but the libidinal ego is love that's gone wild in a way, or to the most extreme forms of it. So moving on, we have the other, what he calls the anti-libidinal ego. So the anti-libidinal ego is an ego that's basically split from the libidinal ego, meaning they don't communicate. So you can't use one against the other. But that anti-libidinal ego is going to attack the object. Meaning that's the ego that realizes how much suffering he had to experience, or she had to experience. And it's going to go against, fundamentally, the object. Because the object is seen as bad, wrong, and sometimes even evil. And that object is what Fairbairn is going to call the rejecting object, because that's what happens when someone is rejected. They internalize that bad object within themselves, and they start attacking, or sometimes rejecting, running away, abandoning the object. And basically what Fairbairn says is that it might seem that that's the big problem in psychotherapy, but it's not, because the anti-libidinal ego, even though it can't be brought in as an ally because the separation is not there. What you have to understand is that even though it's hatred is still a bond, so it can't be used to detach. but it can at least be used as a moment of insight for the patient to realize all the suffering they've been through because of that object, that external bad object, right? So very basically, the libidinal ego is linked with the exciting object, and the exciting object, which is an object that's tantalizing, creates a good object in the mind of the individual. A good object that's very fundamentally flawed, but gives the idea of that there can be an ideal situation in which the person will be alleviated of all frustration or sadness, and that object would be ideal. And here I have to point out that for Fairbairn, the ideal object is not like Klein. It's very, very different. For Fairbairn, the ideal object is basically a good sin. It's what is linked to the central ego, meaning that when the relationship is good enough, it creates a loophole of rewards, which the central ego is going to use to grow. So meaning our identity, our sense of self is built on the backbone of a good relationship, meaning the good relationship makes us better, more complete, more wholesome, if you want, in a way that the true sub-egos don't. They're much more split and much more divisive. So that's Fairbairn's big approach to meta-psychology. And you can already see why it didn't catch on, because he said that the libido is object-seeking, and that he also was very adamant that there was no death drive. What we consider death drives are, are basically effects of the antilibidinal and libidinal ego, but they're not something of a drive for Fairbairn. What you also should keep in mind when I'm talking about this is that for him, the drives are the testimony of a failed object relation, meaning that the drives only occur because the object is not there. And he gives the example of a child sucking his thumb because there's no breast to suck. And in the same way, it's something that I've also kind of associated with drug use, as one uses drugs in a way to fulfill oneself, a bit like what Joyce McDougall's, when she talks about neo-objects and neo-needs. We're into that. Basically, for Fairbairn, drives and everything that happens are techniques that the individual will use to cope with the absence or the badness of the object. Which brings us to a new point of Fairbairn. For Fairbairn, what is very important is how the individual internalizes his world. Because for Fairbairn, the infant can't master the external world, but he can always master his internal world, meaning that in extreme cases, the infant can live within himself or herself to an extreme, and might give very schizoid positions. Schizoid positions that Fairbairn talked about to a great extent. However, he was not really the master of schizoidness. That was more Guntrip, which I've talked about in a previous video, so I'm not gonna... But funny little anecdote, you should know that Guntrip was Fairbairn's direct disciple, Analysand. So, interesting. So Fairbairn is like the core origin of Guntrip. Like Guntrip is an enrichment of the theories of Fairbairn. But anyway, saying on Fairbairn, he has this idea that schizoid developments happen within everyone. That at the core of every single individual, at the very, very core, even in people that are very extroverted, there's a schizoid dimension of rejecting the world to withdraw within oneself. And he was basically, I feel that his article on the schizoid factors in personality remains to this day one of the best short articles on the schizoid phenomena. Even if I feel Guntrip has gone further, I think that the basis laid by Fairbairn still remains incredibly relevant to the schizoid phenomena. At least that's my opinion on it. And there's another point that I found very interesting in Fairbairn's whole thinking, is that he was one of the first people to really deal with trauma in a real way. There was Ferenczi, but he brings trauma into a new dimension, because for him, what's going to create real psychopathology is the traumatic elements of rejection, abandonment, frustration, belittlement, and he's going to take the idea that basically there's something that happened in reality, and then it's not just the internal fantasy world as Freud. It's something different. It's something that goes beyond, and it mixes both reality and fantasy, and how the two come together. You also should know, a very interesting fact, that Fairbairn worked with people who were very traumatized. For example, children that were abused by their parents, severely abused, put in institutions because the parents were unable to take care of them. And that's how he created his meta-psychology. It's when he saw those children, even though their parents were abusive, evil with them, and sometimes just sadistic outright, still wanted to go back to mom and dad, even though they were so severely abused. And he felt that Freudian meta-psychology could not explain that. That was like something that went far, far beyond what Freud could explain, because if it was pleasure-seeking, they should not want to see their parents ever again. And yet there they were, wanting to see their parents, even though they were going to be hurt. And that's how he came up with those ideas. He was also a clinician that worked a lot with war veterans, and also people suffering from what was called at the time war neurosis, which was an old way of saying post-traumatic stress disorder, and neurotic disorders, right? So basically, Fairbairn had really a clinical experience that I feel was much more grounded in trauma and its effects upon humans. That's what led him to develop his ideas. He also has a very interesting point of view on repression, because as you know, or might know, for Freud, repression is basically the idea that the individual feels guilty for incestuous wishes and aggressive dimensions, and he's going to, because of the guilt, repress it. For Fairbairn, that's not the case. The person represses, yes, but he doesn't repress through guilt. He represses because he doesn't want, with the coming back of trauma, the coming back of the bad object, that object that hurt them so much, is going to come back full force. And that's why it's repressed, because the bad object can destroy the psyche, and that has to be pushed away in order to protect the mind of its impact. And that's a very interesting point of view, which I find to be very clinically true. And I think that it's not talked about enough during the studies to become a therapist. But it's a very true, I think, in nature. And there's also a funny side to Fairbairn, notably his miscellaneous articles, which are very free and very funny. There's one on communism, which I've reviewed, which is a very entertaining one, and there's also one on psychoanalysis. And that's basically the gist of an introduction to Fairbairn. He was a very, I feel, interesting author to read and to understand. Even though I really think when you read him, you should read more like people who have written about him, like Solani, which I've reviewed also on this channel. Because those people are going to ease you through Fairbairn, because Fairbairn is not easy to read at all. Like, he's very technical, very pinpointy, and he even uses Latin and French in his texts. So, I mean, hard read, but there's been good introductions. And even though he was not well known at the time, I feel that his ideas have kind of trickled down to psychoanalysis mainstream, even though we're not necessarily talking about it too much. But people like Thomas Ogden, Otto Kernberg, and I think Dougal, to an extent, McDougall, all of them were influenced, I think, in a way or in another, by Fairbairn and his ideas. So that pretty much sums it up for this long introduction. I hope you found it interesting. And if you ever have a question, or you feel that I've missed something, because I've speed run it a bit, but there's still a lot to be said about Fairbairn because he was a very rich author in terms of fairies and production. So please feel free to let me know. I'll see you in the next one.